The Nintendo Switch 2 might be one of the safest sequels Nintendo has ever made. It is basically the original Switch, but bigger, faster, more refined, and considerably more expensive. There is no completely new concept here, no dramatic redesign. Nintendo took one of the most successful consoles ever made, improved basically everything about it, and called it a day. And honestly, that initially made it difficult for me to get excited about it. But after owning the Switch 2 since December, I think I finally understand it. The Switch 2 does not make sense because it is the most powerful handheld. It doesn't have the best display, and it definitely doesn't have the cheapest games. It makes sense because it removes almost every barrier between wanting to play a game and actually playing it. Depending on the kind of player you are, that could make it either one of the best gaming handhelds ever made or a completely unnecessary upgrade. So, who is the Nintendo Switch 2 actually for, and why has it completely redefined gaming for me? Let's take a look. We need to start with the price, because it affects almost everything else about this console. At the time of recording, the Switch 2 has a suggested retail price of $449.99 in the United States. Nintendo, however, has announced that the price will increase to $499.99 on September 1st, so depending on when you are watching this, it may be even more expensive. And that is before buying a game, additional storage, a carrying case, or in my case, something that will make it more comfortable to hold. So this is definitely not an impulse purchase. The Switch 2 has to justify itself. Inside, you get the console itself, 2 Joy-Con 2 controllers, 2 straps, the controller grip, a dock, an HDMI cable, and a power brick with a detachable USB-C cable. So you can use it in handheld mode or connect it to a television without immediately buying another cable or adapter, which, considering the price, is probably the least Nintendo could do. You also get 256 GB of internal storage. That is a massive improvement over the original Switch, but expanding it for game storage requires a microSD express card. Your older standard microSD cards cannot be used to run Switch 2 games, so additional storage could become another fairly expensive purchase. In other words, the price of the console is only the beginning, and that price would be much harder to accept if the hardware did not feel like a genuine upgrade. Thankfully, it does. The Switch 2 might be one of Nintendo's most predictable designs ever. It is still a screen with 2 detachable controllers attached to either side. Nintendo did not replace the original idea because it didn't need to. Instead, almost every part of the design has been enlarged or refined. The Joy-Con 2 controllers are bigger, and I find them noticeably more comfortable than the original Joy-Cons. They now attach magnetically with a physical lock-in mechanism holding them in place. The connection feels far more substantial than sliding the original controllers onto rails, and attaching them is genuinely satisfying. The redesigned kickstand is also excellent. It is wide, sturdy, adjustable across a much greater range of angles, but the Switch 2 still has one major ergonomic problem. The back is almost completely flat. That makes it thin and easy to slide into a bag, but gives your hands very little to support during longer handheld sessions. So I used mine with a grip case, and the difference is massive. Of course, that also makes the console considerably thicker and less packable. So the design creates a genuine trade-off. Without the grip, it is more portable, and with the grip, it is more comfortable. And after using the Switch 2 on a train while traveling, I understand why Nintendo prioritized something that fits easily into a bag. I just wish that comfort did not require another accessory. The improvement that surprised me most was not the processor, it was the display. Before buying the Switch 2, I owned the Switch OLED for a few months. So when Nintendo announced that its successor would return to an LCD panel, I assumed it would feel like an obvious downgrade. In one way, it does. The OLED model still produces much deeper blacks and stronger contrast in a dark scene. The Switch 2 has a much larger 7.9-inch display with a full 1920 by 1080 resolution. It also supports HDR, variable refresh rate, and rates of up to 120 Hz in compatible games. And in everyday use, I usually prefer it. It is extremely bright, it looks incredibly vivid when HDR is properly supported, movement can feel smoother for software that actually takes advantage of the higher refresh rate, and the larger size makes games feel considerably less cramped. And that last part matters more than I had expected. The Switch 2 might not look dramatically larger in pictures, but the display occupies far more of the vision while playing. It makes the experience feel more immersive without turning the console into something completely ridiculous to carry. The OLED still wins in dark scenes, but the Switch 2 almost everywhere else that I personally noticed during normal use. Nintendo also never implemented HDR on the Switch OLED, so despite the newer console using an LCD panel, supported games can often look more impressive overall. And that is the first reason the Switch 2 finally makes sense. Nintendo did not abandon what worked about the original, it made the experience feel less compromised. The performance improvement is also substantial, but quoting processor architecture and theoretical graphics numbers does not really explain what that improvement feels like. The difference becomes obvious when a game receives a proper Switch 2 upgrade. The game I have spent the most time playing is The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, and on the original Switch it was already an incredible game, but it was also clearly pushing against the limitations of that hardware. The Switch 2 edition improves its frame rate and resolution, reduces loading times and adds HDR support, and the difference is immediately noticeable. Movement feels smoother, the image looks cleaner, loading interrupts the experience less frequently, and HDR gives bright areas far more impact. But Nintendo has also added a genuinely useful feature called handheld boost mode. When enabled, compatible Switch 1 games can run while undocked as though the console were operating in TV mode. That means those games can use their strong docked profiles while you are still holding the system in your hands. There are some compatibility limitations and it will not improve every game, but it makes the enormous original Switch library even more valuable. There are handheld PCs that give you more freedom, more storefronts and access to enormous existing libraries. But the Switch 2 has one advantage that is easy to underestimate. It is an actual console, and that is not an insult to the Steam Deck, ROG Ally or any other handheld PC. It means that Switch 2 is one fixed target. Every standard Switch 2 has the same core hardware, operating system and controls, so developers know exactly what to target when they are building around that machine. That does not guarantee that every port will be good. Developers remain perfectly capable of releasing terrible software on any platform, but fixed hardware gives them a much narrower target than a general-purpose PC ecosystem with thousands of possible configurations. The Switch 2 is not trying to be a tiny computer, it is trying to be one complete gaming device, and that consistency is much more important to me than winning a benchmark comparison. But strangely, that is exactly why I value it. I use it mostly in handheld mode, although I occasionally dock it and I have taken it with me while traveling. The system wakes from sleep almost immediately, you press the power button and within seconds you are back exactly where you stopped. There is no desktop to manage, no separate launcher updating itself, no graphics menu making you wonder whether medium shadows look dramatically worse than high shadows, and no operating system deciding that this is the perfect moment to restart. You just play. The Switch 2 actually fits around my life. It does not ask me to fit my life around it. I still use it mostly as handheld, but the docked experience no longer feels like a secondary compromised mode. The Switch 2 can output at up to 4K and 60 frames per second. At 1080p or 1440p, it can output at up to 120 frames per second, provided the game and the display supports it. HDR output is also supported in compatible televisions. Obviously, that does not mean every game runs at 4K or 120 frames per second. Those are the output limits, not guaranteed performance targets, but the overall docked image looks sharper, cleaner, and far more appropriate on a 4K HDR television than the original Switch did. The Switch 2 solves many of the original console's problems. It does not solve all of them. Nintendo estimates somewhere between approximately 2 and 6.5 hours of battery life depending on the game and how the system is being used. That has been enough for the way I use it, including traveling by train, but in more demanding games this is not necessarily a device you can carry all day and completely forget about charging. The flat ergonomics mean I strongly prefer using a grip. the LCD still cannot reproduce the black levels of the OLED model, and the system becomes less portable once you add the accessories that make it more comfortable and practical. But my biggest problem with the Switch 2 is not the hardware, it is buying games. Nintendo's exclusives are one of the main reasons to buy the console. But those same exclusives exist inside Nintendo's closed ecosystem. You cannot decide that a first-party Nintendo game is too expensive and buy the PC version from another storefront. There usually is no alternative version. Your options are to buy it digitally through Nintendo, find a physical copy from a retailer, wait for a discount, or simply not play it. The console itself may cost $449 or eventually $499, but building the library can become truly the painful part. This is where handheld PCs have a major advantage. A PC player may already own hundreds of compatible games, and competition between stores creates far more opportunities for discounts. On the Switch 2, the exclusives are both the strongest reason to own the system and one of the biggest reasons it can become expensive. So does the Switch 2 finally make sense? For a first-time Switch buyer, I think it does. Assuming the cost fits your budget, it is obviously the long-term option. For somebody upgrading from the original Switch, the difference is substantial. The display is larger and sharper, performance is dramatically stronger in properly upgraded games, the Joy-Cons feel more substantial, loading is faster, and the docked output finally looks appropriate on a modern television. For a Switch OLED owner, the answer is more complicated. You lose the OLED's excellent black levels, but you gain a larger 1080p display, HDR, variable refresh rate, potentially much higher frame rates, and far more powerful hardware. The upgrade makes sense if you care about newer games, better performance, and the improved dock experience. It makes less sense if you play the older Switch titles and remain perfectly happy with the OLED screen. And if you happen to own a handheld PC, the decision comes down to a few priorities. A handheld PC gives you more freedom, more storefront competition, and access to an enormous PC library. The Switch 2 gives you Nintendo exclusives, predictable hardware optimization, and a much simpler console experience. The Switch 2 is not perfect. It is expensive, its games can be even more expensive, and the ergonomics still need work. But it might be the console that makes gaming easiest to fit into an actual life. And that is why the Nintendo Switch 2 finally makes sense. Not for everyone, but definitely for me.